Leave, or I'll destroy it. Those words hit me like a slap, echoing down the old dock as I stood there, keys in hand, staring at Margaret Whitman, who looked ready to burn the whole world down just to prove a point. Just hours earlier, I'd locked up my grandfather's cabin, thinking my biggest problem was a leaky roof. But by noon, the HOA president was threatening demolition, sheriff sirens were wailing through the pines, and my quiet weekend had morphed into a legal showdown that would unravel years of corruption, and not in the way anyone expected. You ever feel that moment when a regular Saturday tilts off its axis? That was my morning. 1 second, it's the smell of pine, lake water, and old coffee. Next, it's a war zone of pink notices and fake authority. My grandfather built this place with his own hands after Korea. Rough cedar, windows that stuck in the summer, a dock just big enough for a midnight fishing story. I came up from the city just wanting a little peace. Maybe some repairs. Instead, Margaret appeared from the tree-line in her personal trainer meets drill sergeant glory, mid-50s, blonde hair pulled tight, posture so rigid you'd think she'd been sculpted out of HOA bylaws. "Mr. Harrison," she called, not quite yelling, but with that tone. "You know the one. The I'm in charge and you're about to learn it tone. You received our notice. I trust. Your cabin violates several architectural codes." I smiled, couldn't help myself. Reached into the cabin and pulled out an old green ammo box, paint faded but latches still sharp. Inside, you can't rewrite history just because you want to repaint it. Margaret didn't even flinch, just stepped closer, perfume mixing with pine sap. "Authority changes with the times, Mr. Harrison. The HOA has jurisdiction now, and we're prepared to enforce it." She could have been reciting a speech from her last PowerPoint seminar, but I could see her eyes, calculating, looking for a crack to wedge open. When she whipped out her phone to call the sheriff, I did the same. Hit record. 15 years in construction will teach you that, especially when people like Margaret start talking about compliance. She was already reporting trespassing by the time the first siren echoed off the lake. Not just a call, a demand for backup. Margaret wasn't playing. Sheriff Johnson arrived, tall and weathered, with the kind of slow movements that say he's seen way too much for one small town. He took in the pink notice on my door, the box in my hand, and Margaret's performance. "Afternoon," he nodded, letting Margaret launch into her best courtroom monologue. She threw around words like authority, community standards, willful violation. But Johnson kept glancing at my paperwork, not her face. Finally, he turned to me. "Do you have documentation?" I handed it over. He flipped through the permits, the deed, the surveys. "No drama, no hurry. Mrs. Whitman, unless you've got evidence of a safety violation, this looks like a civil matter," he said, handing the box back to me. I thought Margaret might actually combust. "But Sheriff, the HOA has only the authority the county grants it," Johnson cut in. "And that doesn't cover buildings older than your charter." By the time Johnson pulled away, Margaret's confidence was leaking out onto the gravel. The wind rattled dry leaves, autumn coming on fast. "This isn't over," she muttered, but the edge was gone. I just shrugged, backed out of the driveway, the recording app on my phone glowing like a talisman. What Margaret hadn't counted on was how much paper matters when people start pretending they're the law. Over the next week, my phone rang off the hook, other owners. Stories piling up. Mrs. Patterson paid $18,000 to keep a gazebo her late husband built in the 70s. The Johnsons tore down their workshop after threats. The Millers, locked in a legal standoff over a shed built before disco was even a thing. Every story had the same villain, the same pink notice, the same fear. But now, fear was turning into something else. Thursday's board meeting was standing room only. Margaret tried to command the room, but the faces in the crowd weren't buying it. She called on me, probably expected me to fold. Instead, I pulled out the ammo box, original permits. The HOA's own bylaws. Article 7, Section 3, I read out loud. "Pre-existing structures built to county code are exempt." Margaret sputtered, tried to regain control, but it was gone. Then Mrs. Patterson stood, voice trembling. "I paid thousands because you said I'd lose my house. But my paperwork's older than your bylaws." Murmurs built into a roar. Others started shouting. Questions. David Miller waved his thick folder. demanding to know how Margaret could override county permits. Margaret hammered her gavel, but nobody listened. That's when the room turned. People realized they weren't alone. Margaret's last move was to declare my cabin a safety hazard. I stood up, voice steady. This isn't about safety. It's about control and money, about making people pay for rights they already own. The board fractured right there. One member resigned. Another called for a proper audit. But Margaret wasn't done. The next morning, a lawsuit landed at my door, accusing me of trespassing, demanding demolition. She'd filed with the court, using surveys that didn't match county records, trying to scare me with the weight of official paperwork. But this time, I had backup, a real attorney, Catherine Bennett, who specialized in HOA wars. She spotted the flaw in 5 minutes. The HOA had never legally included my lot. Every fee, every threat, every so-called authority was built on a house of cards. Word got out fast. By the next emergency meeting, Margaret was alone at the head table, her own board members gone, a county commissioner, and 2 journalists in the audience. One by one, residents stood to tell their stories. The dollar amounts were staggering, the humiliation even worse. Commissioner Park called for an immediate audit, a proper election, and a criminal investigation. Margaret tried to resign with dignity, but it was too late. The new board, led by neighbors who actually cared, voted to refund every dollar, to open the books, to rewrite the rules so no one could ever pull this stunt again. The sheriff started taking statements. Margaret's world shrank to the headlights of her car, disappearing into the night. 3 months later, I sat on my dock with a cup of coffee and a fishing rod. The lake quiet, my family's cabin still standing. Margaret was in court, her house up for sale, her reputation in pieces. But across the water, a new family had moved into her place. Kids laughing in the yard, neighbors waving hello. The real authority in Pine Lake had shifted, not because someone shouted the loudest, but because we stood together, shared the facts, and pushed back. So, tell me, what do you think? Was justice served, or did the punishment go too far? Drop your thoughts below. Whose side would you take if your home was on the line? Do you trust your HOA, or is it just another Margaret waiting for the right moment? Let's hear your story. Truth is, I thought things would settle down after Margaret disappeared, but you know how it goes. Sometimes tearing down a bad system just reveals how many people it hurt. A week after that last board meeting, my phone was blowing up with messages from neighbors who'd spent years swallowing their anger, too afraid to speak up. The Johnsons, the Millers, Mrs. Patterson, they weren't just looking for refunds, they wanted answers. Apologies, something that would make sense of the fear that had crept into their lives every time a pink notice landed on their door. Turns out, Margaret hadn't been working alone, not really. People started talking, quiet conversations in kitchens, whispered phone calls late at night, about board members who'd looked the other way, about special funds Margaret kept off the books, about threats made and checks cashed, and nobody asking where the money actually went. And then came Tom Richards, tall, nervous, always clutching his coffee like it might save him. He'd served on the board for years, never questioned much, until all this blew up. One evening, he knocked on my door, face pale under the porch light. "I need to tell you something," he said, voice shaking. Turns out, Margaret had been funneling thousands into a private account, laundering HOA funds through fake invoices and emergency landscaping repairs that never happened. $67,000 gone, siphoned from families who thought they were just paying their dues. By the time the county prosecutor got involved, the evidence was a mountain, not a molehill, recorded threats, bank statements. Even emails Margaret sent in the middle of the night, practically begging her lawyer to cover her tracks. Watching the story hit the local news was surreal, neighbors waving at the camera, holding up old permits and faded pink notices, Mrs. Patterson crying as she described paying $18 grand just to keep her dead husband's gazebo. Margaret, of course, lawyered up. But it was all too late. Within a month, she was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and a laundry list of stuff that would have made my grandfather laugh out loud. The board was dissolved. New elections held. People who actually cared stepped up, brought in a real accountant, voted to return every dollar Margaret stole, plus interest. The funny thing is, it didn't end with the verdict. Community is a fragile thing. It takes time to stitch together what fear tried to rip apart. The next few months felt like group therapy, potlucks, Saturday cleanups, even a couple of bonfires by the lake where folks swapped stories and tried to remember how to be neighbors again. I taught the Miller kids how to fish. Mrs. Patterson started a flower garden near the gazebo, and for the first time in years, people knocked on each other's doors just to say hello. There were arguments, sure. Old wounds don't heal overnight. But the mood shifted, less suspicion, more laughter. Even the property values ticked up, which made everyone shake their heads at how wrong Margaret had been. One Saturday morning, as the sun rose gold over the water, a moving truck rolled up to Margaret's old place, now the Walsh house. Jennifer Walsh stepped out, her two kids bouncing with excitement, waving shyly from behind her. She caught my eye and walked over, hands in her jacket pockets, looking both hopeful and nervous. "I hear you're the guy who fixed things," she said, smiling. "My kids are dying to learn how to fish." I laughed, couldn't help it. "You tell Em to meet me at the dock at 7 sharp. Bring marshmallows. We catch more stories than fish out here anyway." It felt good, finally, to say yes to something as simple as that. But you know what really stuck with me? The way the story spread. Within weeks, other neighborhoods called, people asking for copies of our new bylaws, wanting to know how we did it, how we turned fear into accountability. I spoke at a town meeting across the county, me, of all people, standing at a podium, explaining the power of paperwork, open meetings, and not letting bullies hide behind fancy titles. Catherine Bennett, our lawyer, got 3 new clients out of it. County officials started drafting new rules, making it harder for HOAs to operate in the dark. It wasn't just about Pine Lake anymore. It was about proving that when people speak up, when they ask questions, demand receipts, insist on elections, they can take back what's rightfully theirs. Margaret, last I heard, was serving her time, her old house filled with the sounds of children instead of threats. The board she built on intimidation was gone, replaced by potluck committees and open-door policies. The ammo box my grandfather left me. Now it sits on the mantle, a reminder that every rule worth following starts with someone willing to stand up and ask, "Who says?" The lake's as calm as I've ever seen it. Every so often, I catch myself watching the new kids race down the dock, yelling to their mom that they caught a monster. Never mind, it's just a sunfish. And I realize this is what we were fighting for all along. Not just property rights, not just peace and quiet, but the right to look out across the water and know you belong. So, let me ask you, when push comes to shove, would you trust the folks running your neighborhood? Or do you think every community's got a Margaret hiding in the tall grass, waiting to see if anyone's paying attention? Share your stories, your scars, your victories in the comments below. Because in the end, it's not about the cabins or the lawsuits. It's about what we build together when we finally stop letting fear make the rules.